Hello, I'm Z.R.C. Films. This is a read aloud of my new story from the Shadow Files. Now like, subscribe, lock your doors, turn your lights off and listen.
Officer Michael had been on the force for years, but nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to face. For weeks, children had been disappearing from the small town of Millfield, leaving behind no clues or evidence. And now 5 more children had vanished without a trace. Desperate for answers, Officer Michael and his team had been searching the town and surrounding woods for any sign of the missing children. But their search led them to something far more sinister. In the depths of the woods, they stumbled across the bodies of 2 teenagers who had been missing for weeks. Their bodies were torn apart, with their insides completely missing except for their heads, which were perfectly intact, not even a scratch on them. Officer Michael couldn't believe what he was seeing. How could someone do this? Who would commit such a heinous crime? His mind raced with questions, but the answers remained elusive. As the days passed, Officer Michael became lost in the case. He worked tirelessly, following every lead and chasing every clue, but nothing seemed to make sense. The town was in a state of panic, and he could feel the weight of their fear on his shoulders. But then something strange started to happen. Officer Michael began to hear whispers in the night, voices that seemed to be coming from the shadows. He tried to ignore them, but they only grew louder and more persistent. They spoke of something dark and malevolent, something that had been lurking in the town for years, waiting for its chance to strike. Officer Michael knew he had to find the source of the whispers, but every time he tried to follow them, they would disappear, leaving him lost and alone in the woods. Days turned into weeks, and the missing children were still nowhere to be found. Officer Michael was on the brink of giving up when he found a clue that would change everything. In a small clearing in the woods, he found a strange symbol etched into the ground. It was like nothing he had ever seen before, but something about it seemed familiar. As he stared at the symbol, the whispers grew louder, and suddenly he knew what he had to do. With a deep breath, he reached out and touched the symbol, and the world around him disappeared. When he opened his eyes, he was no longer in the woods. He was in a dark, twisted world filled with horrors beyond imagining. And in the center of it all stood a figure, tall and imposing, with eyes that seemed to glow. As Officer Michael stood before the towering figure, he felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. The demon, Der-Tramdämon, had no visible face except for its piercing eyes and a small line where its mouth should be, forming a twisted smile. It brought its long, slender fingers up to its mouth and whispered to him, "SHHH, the fun has just begun." Suddenly, Officer Michael was thrust back into reality, back in the woods where he had originally found the symbol. He stumbled back to his cop car and drove back to the station, his mind racing with confusion and fear. When he arrived at the station, he was shocked to learn that he had been missing for 3 days, during which time 7 more children had gone missing. He knew he had to act fast to try and solve the case before it was too late. He began to research what he had encountered in the woods, and eventually discovered that Der-Tramdämon was a demon that invaded the dreams of children every 10 years. It would give them nightmares of dying over and over again, slowly feeding off of their fear until it was strong enough to drag them off to its realm to feed on them in reality. Officer Michael knew that he had to act fast, if he was going to stop Der-Tramdämon and save the missing children. He gathered his team, and together they began to search for any clues that could lead them to the demon's lair. Days turned into weeks, and just when it seemed like they would never find the demon, they stumbled upon a hidden cave deep in the woods. Inside, they found the missing children, scared and traumatized, but alive. As they led the children to safety, Officer Michael knew that they had stopped Der-Tramdämon before it could claim any more victims. But he also knew that the demon would return in 10 years, and that they would need to be ready to fight it once again. For Officer Michael, the case of the missing children had been the most harrowing and terrifying experience of his life, but it had also taught him that sometimes the most terrifying monsters were the ones that lived inside our own minds. A week had passed since the children had been found dead, their bodies torn apart in the same way as the 2 teenagers in the woods. Officer Michael was on the verge of losing his mind, struggling to come to terms with the horror of what he had seen. But things were about to get worse. The FBI had shown up, taking over the investigation and bringing Officer Michael and his team in for questioning. As they sat in the interrogation room, Officer Michael tried to explain to the agents about the demon that he had encountered in the woods, but they simply looked at him in disbelief. The FBI agents left the room to discuss the situation, with one agent stating that their story didn't make sense. Another agreed, but said that they had to report things like this anyway. When they returned to the room, they told Officer Michael and his team that they were under arrest for aiding a serial killer and trying to cover it up. They read them their rights as they saw government soldiers and blackened scientists enter the building. Officer Michael and his team were in shock as they were dragged out in cuffs and put into unmarked black SUVs. They had no idea what was happening or where they were being taken. As they drove into the night, Officer Michael couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. He had a sinking feeling that they were being taken to a secret government facility, where they would be experimented on and never seen again. The SUVs pulled into a heavily guarded compound, and Officer Michael and his team were taken inside. They were led down a long, sterile hallway, past rows of closed doors, and finally into a room where they were left alone. As they sat in the silence, they could hear muffled voices and strange sounds coming from behind the walls. They knew that they were in a place where terrible things happen, and they had no idea how they were going to get out. Officer Michael closed his eyes, trying to calm his racing thoughts, but even in the darkness, he could see the demon's eyes staring back at him, taunting him with its twisted smile. He knew then that he had never escaped the demon's grasp, and that he was still trapped in its nightmare world. And as the sounds grew louder and the walls began to close in, he realized that he may never escape. As Officer Michael sat in the sterile room, a scientist entered to question him. The scientist asked about the demon, when it had started, who knew about it, and how powerful it seemed. Michael answered each question to the best of his abilities, still shaken by the experience. Then the scientist asked if they had seen any shadow people during the incident. Michael answered no, confused by the question. After all the questions, the scientist explained that they were a part of a special government agency that worked to stop and contain supernatural entities. She told them that they had been arrested to keep information about it from being known to the public to prevent panic. They were there only until the agency knew they would not speak about what had happened. The scientist led Michael and his team out to a courtyard filled with at least 50 other people. They were all being held for the same reason, and Michael felt a sense of relief knowing that he was not alone. As he looked around, he noticed a young Native American man sitting alone in the corner, watching the others. Michael felt drawn to him and walked over to introduce himself. The young man introduced himself as Maka, a member of a tribe that had long known about the supernatural forces that inhabited the forests. He told Michael about how all his friends were killed by the shadow people on a camping trip. He explained how everyone here has seen all kinds of these monsters and demons, which is why they all are here. As they worked in the courtyard, Michael realized that while the demon may have been terrifying, it had also brought him together with people he might never have met otherwise, and for that he was grateful, even in the face of such horror.
Thanks for listening. Please like, subscribe, and share. If you liked this story, please visit my website to find others just like this. Comment your theories and what you would like to see happen next.